until now. So where were we? Well, we were here. I think this is Copenhagen, so then you know what you're looking at. And this is kind of a symbol for what I'm going to be talking about. If the city changes, well, in this case, if the economy changes, the city changes. But it's also the other way around. If the city changes, it provides us with a different context, in which physical context, socio-economic, etc., in which we do our work, and the work changes. So it's kind of a cycle, a loop that goes back and forth. And I'll use that's what I already introduced just now. I'll use examples from my different fields, which is in Eindhoven, at Design Academy Eindhoven, but hardly from that in this case. Parts from my PhD thesis, and parts from the work that I do at PBL in The Hague, which is a knowledge institute that works for a scientific institute that works for our national government. So I'll be combining these pieces, and I did prepare it like this because I had seen the list of presenters for the autumn school, and I thought, what can I contribute? And I think this is kind of providing you with, also like Hilde, with another context that can help you make sense of the themes of work and the urban environment, collaboration, power relations, co-design, etc., etc. The themes that I think have already been discussed here and are also quite vital in the whole of traders network. I'll give you this ultra short. It remains ultra short because I'm going to do 500 years in 4 slides, more or less. 4 phases of urbanization. But I will give you a little bit more detail on 2 examples. Middle-class suburbia, and then I think we faded out in electricity an hour ago, so I hope this is not a curse. Middle-class suburbia. And I'll be giving you a very, very brief critical reading of the history of North American suburbs. The suburbs, mainly middle-class suburbs around the bigger cities. A critical reading of the history, so it's kind of a meta perspective here. And I'll be doing that to show you one example of what it means to present a certain history in different ways. And this is, of course, interesting if you think in terms of co-authorship, for example. Whose history of urbanization? It also has a kind of a gender element in it, I think. So it connects to Hilde's talk as well. And the other one is completely different tradition in research. There's a spatio-economic reading of a post-mining area in south of Poland, which connects with the Genk situation, I think. And also this middle-class suburbia, I'll give you 2. Okay, I will give you that later on. This middle-class suburbia thing connects with what you see around. If you take the car or cycle or walk in the Genk area, you will see the verkaveling. I think Hilde already used this word, the suburbs Belgian style. We don't have them in the Netherlands, which is 50 kilometers from here, I think, to the border. And the urban landscape changes completely. And I'll give you a little bit of detail. So you can use this as well to read into this landscape where we are now. It's good to have children around. Okay. So a history of cities at work in 4 steps. So it's very brief. The first one, agriculture. This takes us back to medieval times, let's say, I don't know, it doesn't matter, the 1200s or so, when most Western cities were walled cities, completely walled off from their surrounding countryside, but also completely dependent on the surrounding countryside in numerous ways, but one of them, of course, was in terms of food production. So this could be called an agricultural economy, and it is also a trade economy, I think. Trade in terms of food coming into the city, money flowing back and forth between producers, agricultural farmers, knowledge exchange, of course, people meeting in markets, so it's far more than just food. And the city was, it had this wall, but it was completely dependent on these flows, the food flows. Currently we are doing research in The Hague and in all kinds of flows, material flows, energy flows, information flows, flows of people. And the fashion word now is metabolism. It's called the urban metabolism. So it's kind of seeing the city as an organism which connects with the surroundings in terms of what comes in, what goes out. Waste, water, air, what have you. But we use this approach now, but if you use that approach to make sense of a medieval city, it makes sense as well. And I listed some of the street names, not gendered in this case, but street names from in The Hague, where I live and work in the Netherlands. And these are of course in Dutch, and I can translate them to you. These still sketch a picture of the medieval city that The Hague was, because this is all about where different types of markets were in those days. So you have your daily vegetable market, that's the first one. The pig market, the calf market, the long and short beasts market, I don't know how to translate it. We even have long and short legs as a street name, lange en korte poten for Dutch speaking. These were the animals with long and short legs, being traded and consumed and bought in The Hague. So lange en korte poten, long and short legs, are street names still in The Hague as well. I didn't list these. River fish market, so freshwater fish trade, peat market, wood market, beer quay, which was very essential because the water was so polluted you could not drink the water in the Middle Age, in the medieval city, but you could drink beer. So beer was, believe it or not, was a substitute for water back then. So quite vital for urban living to have this connection with beer brewers outside the city, because The Hague didn't have city rights, so they were not allowed to make their own beer. They had to import their beer. So food flows, money flows, trade flows are vital in understanding even our current day cities. And if I say in this case current day cities, our city at this moment, it's the old central parts of Western cities. Hardly around them, or not at all around these central parts. And of course these cities have expanded quite considerably. And in the background you see a painting of the center of The Hague, which is still more or less like this. This is a big church which is still there. Some parts have changed, but it's quite still like this. And if you know how to read the cityscape, you read into this medieval history of this part of the city. So this is an agricultural economy that defines this part of the city. It has changed considerably, of course. This is Caroline Steele's, a British architect who wrote a book called The Hungry City, which is a reading of our urban landscape as we know it today from a food perspective. Very interesting book. This is how we do it today. We don't grow our food outside our cities anymore, but we import our soybeans from Brazil, for example. So a larger footprint, global trade flows, but still cities like the city above there, completely dependent on this metabolism, the flowing back and forth of goods and foodstuffs and what have you. So the city has this gigantic footprint. Distances have expanded quite considerably. And I included some student work, I think it's from 3 years ago, Tom Veldhuis. It was not in my department, but I like his graduation project because he designed a play kit for kids, calling Playing with Food, which is what kids do usually. They play with their food, and in this case they can literally play with their food because you got your farm and your pigs, but you also got your chainsaw to cut down your rainforest, to grow your soybeans in Brazil to have your food here, your meat, and you've got your climate change problems. So this is a critical design, it is a design from a critical design tradition to stimulate the debate in a playful yet very critical way on what it is that you find on your urban plate. So comments on this kind of economy. Another way to comment on it is what Esther van der Wiel, a colleague of mine at Design Academy, has designed. It's also now still on top of the biggest shopping mall in the heart of Utrecht, in the city center. On top of the shopping mall, she designed this, what she calls a garden factory. It's a kind of an urban garden. So, yeah, in some respects, very comparable to Betty's garden, but more urban. Because what she does is she collects food, rest materials from the shops below, so leftovers. She composts that, turns that into material to have your vegetables growing on top of the shopping mall. What comes out of the garden, she brings back to the shops below, and in this way you get a kind of cycle. And she works with local people, local communities, people taking care of the chickens there, etc., etc. School kids, kind of a beehive. It's everything you need in this small scale is there, but then in the heart of a city, making use of leftovers from the shopping mall. So this is kind of a creative city reaction to this expanding of our footprint. Okay, so that was the agricultural economy and our city. The second phase is industrial revolution, end of 18th century, throughout the 19th century, starting more or less in the UK and then expanding quite rapidly into, well, almost all other countries, I think. And at different paces, of course. Factories, slums, and also, again, a reaction to it, the garden city. This is a kind of promotion poster, an advertisement for a Welwyn Garden City in 1920, which I think more or less tells the whole story. Very, very polluted cities. If we talk about pollution today, it's a laugh. It doesn't mean anything. Back then, that was pollution. Perhaps this is what China suffers from nowadays, I think. Some Chinese cities. So that was then, and this sells the story of, okay, if you today you can leave these, if you have the means, of course, leave these cities and commute to in the 1920s that is, commute to the smoke, and tomorrow, and that's of course the promise, you can be living and working in the sun. I'll leave that to promotion people, advertisement people. And the idea behind it is that these very, very polluted cities and also socially, well, very much conflicted cities, slum parts of the cities with very, very poor living conditions for almost all workers, that there must be an alternative. And the alternative that has had the most impact, perhaps the most impact in terms of urbanization in the 20th century is the garden city. The promise here, and this is a model from Ebenezer Howard's Garden City, perhaps you've seen this one because it's world famous, I think, is not a polluted city and some suburbs for commuting around it, but small-sized, more or less self-sufficient communities that include everything that you need. Some shopping areas, some agricultural areas, well, essentially everything you need. Connected by railroads. These are railroad cities still. Car did not exist back then. So self-sufficient, smaller-sized cities. These, in this sense, were never built. So So this was also not a design, it was a model for thinking, also very much a social model. It was organized, these garden cities were supposed to be organized around cooperations, co-ownership, instead of a top-down hierarchical system. Also in this social sense, these were never built, because what was built was garden cities like these, or garden suburbs like these, that were very nostalgic, small scale, but in the end quite for wealthy people. Most of these, like Welwyn or Hampstead, or you have a number of these outside of London, these were quite expensive places to live. So in that sense, garden cities were not built. In Germany, you have another tradition of garden cities that were very much more social, also including gardens like Betty's, for example. I will not go into detail there. So different traditions, but in essence, the model of the garden city was not realized. But it did have a lasting effect. For example, and this is phase 3, as in being a predecessor to suburbia, middle-class suburbia. This is not only a industrial production type of economy, but this is the service sector economy. Think of the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 1970s that is, until now, I think. It's a white-collar service economy. It's office work. This is the dominant developing type of economy, and the city changes considerably during these decades. This is a photo I took on Long Island, just outside of New York City, out in New York City, but outside of Manhattan. Forest Hills Gardens. It's a kind of a copy. It's not a copy, but it's very much inspired by the English garden cities. Nostalgic, pastoral, green, quiet, unaffordable. It's quite expensive, and I'll give you a little bit more details about suburbia in just a moment. But just to understand what you see here, it's a commuting village. Well, it's a suburb for people with office jobs commuting to Manhattan. It was a railroad suburb. So the main way of getting into Manhattan was taking the railroad, the train. And this is how we developed. I think Hilde already mentioned Levittown, right? Yeah, I think so. Levittown was the car version of suburbia. And this is, I think, more or less how we all have our images of suburbia. This is also the American movie that shows you again and again and again this ideal yet completely dysfunctional way of living. Very much criticized, of course, but the idea is, okay, this is where you have your family life. The man, this is the gender aspect, the man traveling to the office on a daily basis. The woman stays at home and has her domestic domain, which is inside the house and perhaps a little bit of the garden, but that's about it.
And the shopping center.
And the shopping mall, yeah. One of the world's allegedly first shopping mall is outside of Levittown. And that's not a coincidence. And the shopping mall is kind of a replacement of the historic city center, because you'll have your public, well, pseudo-public domain inside the shopping mall.
Was it affordable?
This was affordable, yes. This was for lower class, middle class people, and I'll give you some details on that, because there's okay, I'll give you some, yeah, but this is far more affordable than this. This is upper middle class. And it's both completely white also. So there's an ethnic story that I will not go into detail here, but yes, also. So it's kind of multiple ways of dealing with suburbia, but I'll be brief here. So this is a car-dependent city. This is also what we now see as a polluted city and a city full of traffic jams. this is, well, the word city is not used in this discussion anymore. We talk about daily urban systems, or metropolises, or megalopolis, or what have you. There are numerous ways of dealing with this urban landscape that is not a classic city anymore. People traveling for 2 hours and still in the same metropolitan area. So gigantic, sprawling suburbs. Uncontrolled expansion of urban areas. Okay, so the service sector economy. And I know this is brief, right? So it's quite black and white, but it's kind of an essential aspect. The fourth and last phase, and then I'll give two details to give you a little bit more detail in depth. The creative city, and you must be familiar with this creative city, of course, because you are the creative city. Now, think of buildings like these in Amsterdam, Westergasfabriek. Industrial, it's a gas factory. It used to be a gas factory. Not in use anymore, and it's the creative media hub, one of these media hubs, creative hubs in Amsterdam. Conference facilities. For the knowledge economy, for the what economists call knowledge spillovers, which require people to meet in an urban area and exchange ideas. And they don't only do this in these types of buildings, of course. This is a studio in Rotterdam. I think it was an architectural studio, I'm not sure. Where the difference between work and living, for example, living in a suburb and working in the city, is not that distinct anymore. You work in the place that you live sometimes. People work from home. Or you work and you also work in your leisure time, because time off and work is more or less merging. So the city changes. You can also work in so-called third places. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this notion of the third place, but this is one of the third places, also in Rotterdam in this case. A bar, or an espresso bar, or the park. These are the new working places for a lot of people, I think, in this room. So the city responds to it. Cities have to respond to it. They want to be a basis for people like these, people like you, creative people and knowledge workers. And if you work here, one of the consequences is that office buildings from this service sector suburban era, for example near motorways, are becoming vacant. This is one of the main challenges in the Netherlands. I'm not sure about Belgium, but I think it's about 25% of buildings are empty in the Netherlands. Office buildings, that is. So it's a gigantic waste of space. And creative people react. So there's a kind of an action and reaction of people working urban landscape, urbanscapes. And this is in this case Nienke Sibrandi, that came up with the idea of the desktop. If we leave our desks, if we leave our offices and these are vacant, you can grow your own, and of course it feeds back into this urban agricultural story. You can grow your own vegetables on your desk, in your desk. I think I've another one, yes? Yeah. And these become the urban tools. And of course this is not the solution for vacant buildings, but I know, for example, in The Hague that there will be, I think already now, they are building gigantic greenhouses in empty buildings. So this is not only on this smaller scale, but we are transforming our cities as we speak. So this is the fourth phase, the creative city, Richard Florida, etc., etc. The innovative city, the city that will change our city even more rapidly. A lot of people think. Okay, so two examples in this story, and I'll be brief again. The first one is middle-class suburbia, and the other one is Shadowland. And why these two? Well, this is one of the iconic histories of suburbia, and this is a book about Belgium suburbia that was published last year, De Geest van Suburbia, about the verkavelingen, suburbs Belgium style, sprawling suburbs, I think, so all over the place. And if you have the opportunity, just take a car or cycle, and you'll discover what this suburbia here in Genk also means. It has some resemblances with the prototypical American suburb, I think. And the other one, the Shadowlands, is of course the mining era that has ended here, and big companies coming in and also leaving. Well, Ford already has left. So that's why I chose suburbia and Shadowland. First, suburbia. A critical reading of suburbia. And in this case, a very short one. Again, Forest Hills Gardens on Long Island. This picture I took from the railroad station, so that you can read. This is a railroad suburb. It still is. Mostly turned into a car suburb, but okay. It's as if you're in England, right? If you would not know where this was, I would suspect that you would not guess this is just outside Manhattan. But it is. It's heavily inspired by traditional English garden suburbs. It's nostalgic. It's a kind of a bucolic ideal of family living, natural living, stability, etc., etc. And the buzz of work is in the city, in this case in Manhattan. One of the main readings until the early 90s of this history of suburbia, the bedroom communities surrounding the hearts, the working hearts of the city, was by Robert Fishman. It was this book, this book, and other people around him in his school. And this history goes like this. It's the middle class, perhaps the elites, and then the middle classes that have a dream, an ideal. He calls it a utopia even. He uses big words here. And this middle class realizes this dream. And I will quote some of the words that are used in these kinds of histories, in all kinds of articles, books, what have you. And for example, a powerful cultural ideal. So if you read histories like this is for me as a cultural theorist very telling. This is about a powerful class in an economy that has this dream and will realize it. It's an act of will. It's about agency, about the power to do what you want to do. So a powerful cultural ideal, or a compelling vision, or the collective creation of the Anglo-American middle class, the bourgeois utopia. That's the title of the book. So it's about dreams and achieving what you want to achieve. It's an original creation. It's not the automatic fate of this class, etc., etc. These are pioneers that will achieve what they want to achieve. This was the main historical narrative about suburbia, and it was criticized. For example, especially in the 90s, for example, by pinpointing that this was perhaps a powerful cultural ideal, but that these middle class people were heavily subsidized, that they were they were achieving their ideals in an era that was enjoying a technological revolution. For example, in the concrete business, these buildings, and do I have another one? This is also okay. These buildings were prefab buildings. They look like they have been there for ages, but these are quite industrial buildings. They're prefab. This is concrete prefab. Most of the buildings. So if that technology would not have been there, you can have this dream, but you can never build it. So these people that are very critical of this bourgeois utopian reading of history, or writing of history, they say that it's about these kinds of technologies. Aluminum industry, or the creation of a motorway infrastructure, the invention of the traffic light, the car, of course, This is a railroad suburb, but cars are far more important in the 20th century. Bridges, etc., etc., etc. And these kinds of technologies were heavily subsidized by national government, federal government, lower governments. And because of these subsidies, of course, the middle class could achieve its dream. This detail is very much, it's also interesting for Hilda, I think. This is the male commuter running for his train to catch. This is the railroad track here. So this tells the whole story about in terms of gender. It's not a female. There are also flowers. Some lampposts in Forest Hills Gardens have flowers. That's the domestic side. This is the commuter running for his train. So subsidized heavily, and the most heavy critique here was by Kenneth Jackson, who wrote a thick book on, among other things, but mainly about the mortgages that were issued by banks, that were subsidized by government, mortgages that were only available for suburban, newly built, mass-produced levee towns, for example. This is one of the levee towns, so built by a big project developer called William Levitt and Sons, one of 3 levee towns. This is also on Long Island. You could get a mortgage on your house for these kinds of buildings and these kinds of suburbs, but not if you would be living in a central city district with an ethnically mixed social environment. Then you would not get your mortgage, so you would not be able to invest in your direct living environment. So again, very much help for these middle classes in achieving their dream. Completely different story, completely different history, and yet it's about the same urbanization. So if you want to discuss co-authorship, agency, and concepts that we use in the Traders Network, it's not only about co-designing, but also whose history. If you have a meta perspective, who's telling the story, etc., etc. The interesting thing is, it's the last thing that I want to remark for suburbia, then we go to Shadowlands, the last piece of the lecture. The interesting thing is that also in Robert Fishman's book, the middle class disappears completely from the stage, and that is in his second part of his book. And this is the stage in which suburbia becomes a sprawling metropolis. Landscapes like these. Endless expanses of urbanization with big box boulevards like these, asphalt, motorways cutting. Think of Los Angeles. I think you have a picture of Los Angeles. That's the prototypical sprawling metropolis. And if Robert Fishman describes this part of history, he's not describing it in terms of a middle class that acts and that has his dream, etc., etc. He uses completely different words, and I will quote again some of these. For example, it's about decentralizing tendencies, whatever that may be, of modern technology and society, or underlying forces that steer this kind of urbanizations, or structures, or deeper economic trends, or there's no subject acting anymore in this part of his history. It's about patterns, and it's about unconsciousness, it's about doing things without even knowing it. And so this middle class has disappeared from the stage, and it's not responsible in Fishman's reading for this kind of suburbanization. This is unplanned, unsought, unanticipated, etc., etc. So there is no subject in this history anymore. It's, I don't know what is steering it, but it's trends and structures, etc., etc. So he gives this middle class an award for coming up with this ideal and acting on it, and they are not responsible for it getting out of hand like this. At least that is my reading of it. And I'm also, this is again a reading, but it's, I think I've got some arguments. This is also sprawl, of course. Okay, Shadowland, a completely different field. I come from the field of suburban, well, blah, 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 and for the last 10 years I've been in this field, I think, a spatial analysis. So Shadowland, an area that comes from a mining era and has been transformed from the 90s onward mainly into a, I don't know, completely capitalist. So this is communist, it used to be communist Poland, has transformed into a capitalist, run by big company, urban environment. And I'll give you some examples. This is the area in the south of Poland called Upper Silesia, Katowice, Gliwice. Looks like this more or less, and it looks like this if you enter the area. At least 10 years ago. Think of Kolenspoor, that Lisbeth was talking about in the other market. Abandoned tracks all over the place, abandoned, I don't know, nondescript, hard to read, urban or rural, and we call it rurban as a kind of, it's not urban and it's not rural. Wastelands, I think, and this literally is a wasteland. It's not everywhere. This is a very bad situation, I think. A collapsed mine. The road used to be here, and it goes around now. So the mining has stopped. The iron industry that was there has stopped, and this is what it looks like after communist era, in at least 10 years ago. I haven't been back, so I'm really curious what this would look like today. Okay, so if you enter a place like this, and I think Genk is not this bad, of course, but how do you deal with it? If you would do an intervention here, how would you read a landscape like this? Because if you want to do an intervention as a designer, I think you'd better really also spatially try to read what is going on there. What kind of economy is this? What kind of urban landscape is this that is a result of this economy? Okay, I'll enlighten you a little bit. This is kind of the scattered built-up area in this region, very scattered. It's mining, steel industries, and railroads, so heavy industry, with a communist regime in place, and this rural-urban fragmented built-up structure. And then mining goes bankrupt, steel industries are closed, and what then? Well, EU-funded infrastructure, for example. These are all new motorways that were being built back then. I think they're all finished now. For example, connecting the north and the south of Europe, the west and the east of Europe. Gigantic new motorways cutting through this area. A new economy. For example, car industry, just like Genk. That's not a coincidence, I think. I'm not sure if Ford is based there, but I'm sure that General Motors has some big plants there, Opel. Also think of the big box shopping centers like Carrefour and big brands like these. And they built just adjacent to these new motorway systems. So top-down, global money flowing in, both private money and EU public money flowing into this area to have an answer in this post-communist era. It completely changes the economy and it completely changes the urban landscape at the same time. And of course it also completely then changes how people move from one place to another, where they work, etc. And it looks like this if you visit this area. I think this tells you a lot about the local, this is a graveyard. The local rooted community in place for centuries, and EU-funded motorways that are built right on top of it. So if you talk about bottom-up or top-down or community and, well, hierarchy, I think this is quite a bad picture. But it's fascinating, right? I think. It's a hard confrontation of two systems. At least this is why I took the picture. And this is how I read it. And to give you an example of the changes here. This is the old system, the railroads, the mining, the steel industry. And this is the new one. The EU-funded motorways, the big boxes of General Motors, the Opel car plant, the Carrefours, IKEAs, what have you, right? And if you flip it back and forth, you see that this is completely kind of complementary system. It adds, it doesn't do anything with what is already there. It just adds to it. It's completely complementary. And so the city more or less changes its direction. It changes from looking at the railroads and the plants, and it looks now towards the motorway and the IKEAs and the Carrefours. I saw a hand raised, yeah.
What are the circles?
The circles were places that we visited. Yeah, this comes from a book that we did, but yeah, or micro studies that we did in this area. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Excuse me?
How is the book is called?
Tussenland. It's in Dutch.
Okay.
Yeah, but in the reader I included the English piece Shadowland, which is kind of a concise summary of the, but then without the spatial analysis. So yeah, we did not translate the book. Yeah, but I think if you can download it for free. It's a PDF from PBL, the website. I can give you a link. Even without reading it, you can make sense of some of the maps, perhaps, or the photography. Okay, so yeah, this is what it looks like, and I think when we were here, I think it was during the summer school last year, when Hendrik and I, Hendrik, also one of the supervisors from Gothenburg, who could not be here today, but we went up to one of the coal waste mountains just outside Sea Mine here in Genk, and we took exactly the same picture. This is in Poland, and we took exactly the same picture here in Genk. So this landscape is quite the same in some respects if you compare the two regions. And that's not a coincidence. So this could be called top-down. This could be called bottom-up. This is one of the circles that you saw on the map. It was a market that we encountered in one of the former mining areas where the mining had left, and where people themselves self-organized informally, and we thought also illegally, a marketplace for all kinds of commodities. I think it was about some car parts, mobile phones, well, all kinds of goods in caravans and booths like these. So this could be called bottom up. But when we dove into detail here, when we did a more in-depth network analysis of what was happening there, we were quite surprised. I think we misread, at first glance, we misread what was going on there. It was not just bottom up as a reaction to top down. It was an intricate network of all kinds of people self-organizing informally, co-designing. Well, it was not design, it was quite badly done, but wonderful in its improvisation. But co-doing it, but also very formal, a market bureau, taxing. These people were carefully taxed. They were paying taxes. There were all kinds of regulations. There was security, so it was also very formal. The government knew all about it, so it was completely. They were aware of this going on. So it was not top down and bottom up. It was a new way of reshuffling economic positions, reorganizing, literally physically reorganizing the landscape in this particular market. And I included this to urge you, if you use terms like bottom-up or the co and blah 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 thing, be specific there, because it's most of the time very much more complicated than you think. And I'm sure when we were in Betty's garden or in the andere markt, if you have the interaction with the community, you discover these really intricate networks that you are not familiar with at first glance. So these were two examples of how you can deal with, I don't know, the city, work, agency, who's in charge, who's acting, on whose behalf, who's writing history, who's organizing, who's changing the landscape, and also how the city as a physical environment changes us, transforms us into behaving differently. Yeah, that was about it. Thanks.